But some scholars have counted it up and found that there are 2,000 unique verses in the Bible that speak specifically about God's heart for the poor around us. And not only that of all the commands in the Bible, 15% of all of the commands in the Bible are explicitly and specifically about how God expects his people to live among the poor. Here's what's, I think, ironic about that. For the last 100 years or so, focus on the poor, talking about the poor, it's sort of gotten stereotyped as a theologically liberal perspective. We call it the social gospel. Like, if we're focusing on that, if we're talking a whole lot about that, it's probably an indication that we've moved away from some of the things that are really, really important to God. It's sort of a theologically liberal perspective. But come on, think for a second. 2,000 verses. 15% of the commands. If we're people who are going to be serious about the Bible, believe we're serious about Jesus, don't we have to talk about that? Well, good morning. Hey, if you got a Bible today, go ahead and get it in front of you and meet me in 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3 is where we're going to be today. As you just heard, for part 3 of a series that we've called The Compelling Resistance. And really simply, our question is, how in the world does that happen? You just saw that graphic and that bumper video. How in the world does a small group of people, less than 100, who live in a really powerful culture with a current that is also really powerful and that's moving in the opposite direction of them in a whole lot of different ways, how do they not just stand firm? How do they stand up and stand out in a way that turns the tide in a world around them? And in some ways that we're still experiencing the benefit from today, even those of us that don't follow Jesus. Really, we're asking the question, what does it look like to walk in the way of Jesus as people like us in a world like this? As we've looked over the last couple of weeks, we've said it's actually pretty simple. These people lived at the intersection of 3 things that all just so happen to begin with the letter C. Control, condemn, and criticize. They just discovered if you can grab as much power as possible and hold it for as long as possible over as many people as possible, if you can just condemn everything really loudly that you see out there that's out of sync with the way that you kind of want to live, and if you can criticize people individually in your world for screwing up your life and the life of everybody around you, you can change the world that way. Except that's not the way they changed the world. In fact, in a lot of ways, they lived in the opposite direction of that. There's a Roman historian that complained really early on that some of the Christians wouldn't even show up for arguments they were invited to because they just believed that arguments were worth arguing with. And instead, they decided if they could really patiently, really clearly live their life at the intersection of conviction and compassion and courage, if they would live that way, if they would even be willing to die for those things, perhaps the world could change. And anything less than all three of those would be less than the way of Jesus. They believed if they would consistently hold themselves and hold each other to that standard, that their lives and perhaps their death would speak more loudly than any other argument. That they'd be more persuasive than any public debate. And you know what history says? They were right. Over a long period of time, 200 or 300 years, the culture at large came to the conclusion that even though they didn't agree with the Christians about the center of their worldview, they desperately wanted to live in a world like theirs. We've said in some really clear, specific ways that these Christ followers stood out. In fact, historians are almost completely unified that these Christ followers believed that the life and the death and the resurrection and the presence and the power of Jesus with them compelled them to champion life in a world of death. To be people that believe that sex was sacred. To be one of the world's first, if not the world's first, multiracial community, multi-ethnic community. To extend mercy to the poor, and to live with a posture of grace and non-retaliation in an angry, divided world. As we get going on a topic today, I just want to do a little thought experiment with you, even looking at that list that's up there right now. Just think about that for a second. We said over the last couple of weeks that actually in the last couple of years, all 5 of those topics has a radioactive charge attached to it, doesn't it? So I just want you to think, though, for a second about your life and your passions, the area that you're most passionate about in a radioactive world, about all 5 of those things. What's at the top of your list? You don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to write it down. You don't have to tell anybody else. But I want you to get it in your mind. What's the thing on that list that you are most passionate about? And then maybe think about those 5 things, even if all of them are important. Which one are you the least passionate about? And then what about God? All of those things are important. What do you think He's most passionate about? Or least passionate about? Okay, this is a grace place, so I'm not going to ask you to show your results or raise your hand or share your answers. But I'm going to make an assumption based on my knowledge of us. And I think it's an educated guess because I know a lot of you and you know me, and even those of you that I don't know, some of us follow each other on social media. I see the things that you post about. I see the things that you're passionate about. And I'm just going to make a guess, unless you knew that this was potentially a trick question that a preacher would ask to get an answer from you that's different from the answer that's true, that most of us don't have mercy of the poor at the top of our list of things that we're the most passionate about these days. In fact, it's interesting. I was at dinner last night with several friends of ours. Many of them go to this church, and they asked what we were talking about today. I told them we're going to talk about mercy with the poor, and one of them said, that's good, taking the day off, huh? Like, and all of these things, that doesn't seem to be the thing that most of us are the most passionate about. I bet it wasn't on your list of things that you believe God's most passionate about. And in fact, for a whole bunch of us, if you're anything like me, maybe it was at the bottom of both lists. You want to know something interesting? Some people have counted, I didn't count, but some scholars have counted it up and found that there are 2,000 unique verses in the Bible that speak specifically about God's heart for the poor around us. And not only that, that of all the commands in the Bible, 15% of all of the commands in the Bible are explicitly and specifically about how God expects His people to live among the poor. Here's what's, I think, ironic about that. For the last 100 years or so, focus on the poor, talking about the poor, it's sort of gotten stereotyped as a theologically liberal perspective. We call it the social gospel. Like, if we're focusing on that, if we're talking a whole lot about that, it's probably an indication that we've moved away from some of the things that are really, really important to God. It's sort of a theologically liberal perspective. But come on, think for a second. 2,000 verses. 15% of the commands. If we're people who are going to be serious about the Bible, believe we're serious about Jesus, don't we have to talk about that? In fact, that's exactly what John tells early Christ followers in 1 John chapter 3. Are you there? Do you see that? 1 John chapter 3. Look down at verse 16. John says this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and truth. So if you're not familiar with the book of 1 John, it was written by the disciple who called himself the disciple that Jesus loved. And he wrote to a group of people who found themselves confused. There were false teachers that had come in to their midst and had begun to talk about something called Gnosticism. Really simply, Gnosticism was this idea that there's a top secret way to get extra intimacy with Jesus, to be a little bit closer with Jesus than everybody else, but it's only available to the initiated. So if you want to think in our day, it's sort of like if Scientology and Christianity had a really weird looking baby. That's Gnosticism. And as a result of that, the people that followed Jesus had started to find themselves really insecure about whether or not they were actually walking the way of Jesus with Jesus, or if they were missing something. And John writes them a letter, and he gives them in this letter 3 big tests, not to know if they're going to go to heaven when they die, but how to know if they're walking in intimacy with Jesus while they live. 3 tests. Chapter 1, he gives them the convictions test, the truth test. He says if we say that we're walking with him, but we're not walking in truth, we're not walking with convictions, we lie. We're not walking in the truth that way. Chapter 2, he gives them the courage test. It says in 1 John chapter 2, we know we've come to know Jesus intimately if we keep his commands in a world where there's a social cost to keeping his commands. So he talks about convictions. He talks about courage. If you've been following along in the series, what do you expect when you get to chapter 3? You expect the compassion test, don't you? And that's exactly what you get. But notice, not just compassion in general, not just be nice to people. John gets pretty specific. He says, if you want to know whether or not you're walking in the way of Jesus in the world, think about what your heart does, verse 17, and think about what your hands do, verse 18, when it comes specifically to the poor. So what does your heart do? What do your hands do when it comes to the poor around you? If you're anything like me, that's perhaps a hard thought to think. Maybe you can relate to me. When it comes to thinking about the poor around me, I find myself bouncing back and forth between 2 extremes, either paralysis on one hand or cynicism on the other hand. When I think about the poor around us, I tend to think when it comes to, generally speaking, the poor in the world, I think, gosh, like what can I do? What can somebody like me? What can even just people like us? When it comes to the problem of poor and poverty in the world, we're a drop in the bucket. I'm a molecule in the drop of the bucket. What can I do? Paralysis. But then I think, well, maybe I don't have to really fix the problem of poverty in the world. Maybe I could just do something close to me, maybe just one-on-one, sort of the starfish principle. You know, do for one what you wish you could do for everybody. But then when I start to get really specific and think about what I could do, and primarily for me, I think in the terms of resources and finances, the person that's standing in front of me, well, if I give my resources, if I give my finances to that person, they're probably going to use it for fill in the blank. And I bounce back and forth between paralysis and cynicism. What does it look like to love with words and speech and actions and truth when it comes to following Jesus in a world like ours, specifically when it comes to the poor? Well, first of all, maybe we ought to define what it means to be poor to begin with. And it turns out that's pretty important in figuring out what to do. You got to figure out how to define it. So, what do you think of when you think about what it means to be poor? If you're anything like me, probably you think in terms of having a lack of some kind of a material need that you need in order to survive. Something like food or water or shelter. Some kind of material need for survival. You know, it's interesting. That's what I tend to think of when I think about what it looks like to be poor or to be in poverty. It's almost never what the poor talk about when you ask them what it means to be poor or in poverty. In fact, 20 or 30 years ago, the World Bank did a huge study where they sent hundreds of journalists into some of the poorest, most impoverished places in the world and asked the poor what it means to be poor. And their responses are staggering. I just want you to see some of them. You can find them all on Amazon, the whole 3-volume set of all of these interviews and the conclusions that they found. A woman in Moldova said this when it comes to defining what it means to be poor. She said, "Poverty is pain. It feels like a disease. It attacks a person not only materially, morally. It eats away at one's dignity and drives one into total despair." A man in Pakistan said this, "We poor people are invisible to others." That's what it means to be poor. Just as blind people can't see, they can't see us. Person in Latvia, "Poverty is humiliation. The sense of being dependent, being forced to accept rudeness and insults and indifference when we seek help." You notice something in those voices? They almost never mention things like food or clothing or shelter. I think that's really important. When I, as an upper class, middle upper class, white guy living in Fort Worth, Texas, think about poverty, I tend to think in terms of a lack of resources. When the poor think about being poor, they tend to think of a lack of relationship. I think in terms of surviving. They talk about thriving. And throughout the scriptures, you get an even bigger vision of God's heart for people. Not just surviving, not just thriving. God's heart for people is that we would be people of flourishing. And all of us, the vision of God is not just that we would sprout or show flickers of life in the place that we're planted. It's not just that we would survive. It's not just that we would thrive, that we would put on a good grow show in the garden with deep roots and big leaves that don't ever do anything or produce any fruit. God's vision for every single person that He's created and placed on the earth is that we would flourish in every way. Bear fruit and multiply. It's more about than just having babies. That's Genesis 1 stuff, right? Of course, Genesis chapter 3 tells us that sin came into the garden and derailed everything, brought death through sin, and it made everything complicated. We said that last week. It disintegrated the world. Not only is flourishing no longer a foregone conclusion for us and for people around us, it's become incredibly complex and complicated to get to flourishing at all. Just like in your garden. Weeds, overgrowth, soil condition, location, pests, heat, lack of water, overwater, lack of resources, over-resources, disease. It's hard enough to survive. And a lot of stuff to hold back flourishing. So with that in mind, here's what it means to be poor when you look at the description of the Bible. To be poor is to lack one or more things that are necessary for a person to flourish. It's to lack one or more things that are necessary for a person to flourish. And that's a pretty broad definition, isn't it? Which means being poor could mean a lot of things. It could apply to a lot of people. And it can come from a lot of places. And you see that in the Bible. Sometimes the scriptures describe people who are poor because of a crisis. People that are poor because of a crisis. Ruth and Naomi are the clearest example of that. The whole book of Ruth is written about a person who, and actually a group of people who find themselves with a couple of crises all at the same time. There are a bunch of examples in the scripture where people find their ability to survive or to thrive or to flourish or threatened by a crisis around them. You see that in our world too. Tsunamis, famines, serious illnesses or an accident can plunge a person into poverty. A situation where they lack something that they need in order to flourish. Sometimes it's something they need in order to survive. Sometimes it's something they need in order to thrive. Sometimes it's something that they need in order to flourish. But it can come from a crisis in the life of a person. You also find in the Bible people that are poor because of a consequence. Some kind of a personal or moral failure. Cain is the first example of that, book of Genesis. Murders his brother and finds himself in a place that isn't safe, where basic needs aren't simple. Finds himself outside of relationship structures that can help him as a consequence of a moral failure. That happens in our world too, doesn't it? It gets complicated, but a series of bad decisions or even relational breaks, sometimes addiction, can cause a person to lack what they need to thrive and flourish. Sometimes a person's poverty can be caused as a consequence. And you also find people in the Bible, and actually the Bible talks about this a lot, who are poor as a result of corruption. Corruption, broken social structures and systems. The Bible explicitly mentions things like legal systems that favor the privileged or the exploitation of the poor by people that have power. It explicitly talks about unjust lending practices, all the way up to social networks that keep the rich connected and other people, either accidentally or intentionally, out. In those 2,000 verses, 15% of the commands in the Bible's really clear-eyed that the problem of poverty is a really complicated and complex problem. But it's also really clear about the responsibility of the people of God. You know what you don't see? 2,000 verses, 15% of the commands. You don't ever see the words "as long as" when it comes to the responsibility of people like us to care for the poor among us. You don't ever see the words "as long as." You don't ever see the exception. Care for the poor as long as they're only poor for this reason and not that reason. You don't ever see the exception. Why? I think John says it because there weren't qualifications and exceptions when it came to how God in Christ loved you. Here was the conviction of the early Christ followers about the way of Jesus based on 1 John 3, 16 to 18, and 1,997 other verses in the Bible. Unqualified care for the poor is one of the clearest ways that we reflect how we've been loved and who we've been loved by. Unqualified care for the poor is one of the clearest ways we reflect how we've been loved and who we've been loved by. John says that explicitly, doesn't he? We were far from God and loved by Jesus. Why were we far from God? What was the situation? Was there a crisis? Well, yeah, especially for some of us that made us be far from God. What about a consequence of some personal moral failure? Is that part of our story? Book of Romans says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death, separation from Him. What about corruption? The world, the flesh, the devil, a sin-sick, fallen world system. Is that part of our story? That's part of our story too. All of us were spiritually impoverished until Jesus came near and indiscriminately met our need. None of us were spiritually middle class when it came to Jesus. We were bankrupt. We were destitute. We had empty hands, needing a handout to survive, and also to thrive, and also to flourish. We were people in need of grace for all kinds of reasons. And Jesus met our ultimate and eternal and often immediate needs with no strings attached. John says, how can you know that about yourself and not put your head and your heart and your hands toward the places around you where people are failing to survive or thrive or flourish? But the question is, what does that mean? What would it look like? Does it mean just all of us should go out and kind of make it rain, on people around us, all of the cash that we've got, just dump it out? Does it mean we should never allow ourselves to have nice things until everybody has the same things? When you look through the scriptures, Scripture doesn't ever say that. In fact, it's clear-eyed about the fact that the poor and poverty is a complicated problem that doesn't have one-size-fits-all solutions. But I do think, as with all of the other topics, we find the way to live in the way of Jesus. I think he models 3 different ways to be part of the solution depending on where a person or a people group is stuck. or held back from flourishing. And I'll move really, really quickly here for the sake of time. If you don't want to move quickly, if you want to move a little more slowly, let me just recommend a book for you that talks about these categories, and I think pretty well. The book is When Helping Hurts by a couple of guys, Brian Fickert and Steve Corbett. Subtitle is How to Alleviate Poverty Without Hurting the Poor and Yourself. If you're interested in diving a little deeper, I think it's helpful in the conversation. It's where I'm borrowing some of these concepts that we're going to talk about in the categories for us to think through as people like us that are trying to be a part of the solution and often find ourselves oscillating between being paralyzed and cynical. What you find out is when you walk in the way of Jesus, the way we saw Jesus walk last week, when you're willing to pause, when you're willing to get personal, when you're willing to partner with a person, you often find that the person in front of you and the people group around you is full of people not just with political issues, but with names and faces and needs. And as you get to know names and needs, what you often find is the challenges are complicated. And yet you see Jesus responding different ways depending on the person in front of him and the need that they had. You remember the Good Samaritan story. That's the first simple one to talk about. You see an unknown traveler who's walking around the side of the road, Luke chapter 15, and is not in the position to flourish. He's not even in a position to thrive. Luke 15, this traveler by the side of the road is a person who's fighting to survive. And you see what the good neighbor does? The good neighbor provides relief. Here's what relief is. Relief is something that we give to someone who likely won't survive if they don't get it. Relief, food, water, shelter, life-giving, life-saving medicine. So this is what we normally think of, at least us, when we think of being there for the poor, helping the poor. Here's the thing. It's our most common response, but it's the least common need. Here's where it gets tricky. What if you go into a situation with relief, where the temporary need for relief is over? You know what you do? It's a little like overwatering or over-fertilizing your garden. You can make everything worse. We could reinforce the sense of invisibility, shame. Remember the voices of the poor that we looked at earlier. We can rob people of their dignity, all the while feeling good about how we helped them when we bring relief to situations that no longer need relief. We can even hold someone in poverty, thinking that we're helping them out. Sometimes they don't need someone to do something for them. Sometimes they need somebody to do something with them. Call this rehabilitation. Rehabilitation. You see Jesus live this out, maybe most clearly with a woman named Mary Magdalene. When Jesus meets her, she is poor in all kinds of different ways. And he set her free. But then he walked with her and empowered her and helped her develop to a place where she herself was flourishing. Sometimes it's not a lack of food that's keeping a person from thriving. Sometimes what they really need is a friend to eat the food with, who can see them and hear them. Remind them that they're created in the image of God, that they have dignity and purpose and skills to offer the world where they live, who could help them uncover them and develop them and steward them well. Some of you saw the huge New York Times piece this week that studied upward mobility for the poor, and they determined the relationship connection was more important in a person's economic trajectory than their neighborhood, than their education, than their race, than any other characteristic that they have. That's huge. Often the poor in our lives don't need cash. They need connection. And sometimes they need our connections, our expertise, our influence, our referrals, our introductions. And that takes us to the last one. Write the word reform. Reform. This is where it gets really complicated and sometimes really controversial, doesn't it? Because this isn't just about giving something to someone. It's not even just about doing something with someone. Sometimes it's about going ahead of someone and clearing the path ahead of them to make sure that they have the structure and the strength and the systems that they need in order to flourish for the long haul. We've talked about the trellis in the garden before. That's the idea here. Creating structure and support for the young and the vulnerable so that they can have the strength or borrow the strength that they need in order to flourish. Jesus dealt with this in Luke chapter 14. You can read that story later. He talked about networking dinners in his day. And he challenged his followers to look at the social system around them, where the rich only invited the rich to their house for dinner, to make connections, to make business deals. And it created a social structure that either intentionally or inadvertently kept the poor outside. They didn't ever really have a chance. Jesus said, don't do that. Reform. Here's how this fleshes out in and through doxology, and then we'll close. If you go back and think about what this looks like for us and the kind of difference that we can make at a church, here's something I think you'll realize. Institutions, we can't do all of that. In fact, we're not necessarily in position to do all of that and do all of that well. We can champion some of that, but we can't do all of that. What organizations and institutions tend to be pretty good at is relief. We tend to be pretty good at coming in a moment and pooling our resources and sending a big infusion of resources to a place or to a person that can help them get back on their feet in a crisis situation. We tend to be pretty good about that. Some of you remember what we were able to do back at the very beginning of the crisis in Ukraine. Because of some of your proactive generosity, we were able to look around and see a need, make sure that a gift was going to be safe and secure and strategic, and then we made a huge investment, $50,000, that kept some people eating for months in Ukraine, all because of your proactive generosity and our ability to respond to a crisis need. We were able to go with relief. Churches tend to be good at that. Institutions tend to be good at that. Maybe closer to home, every Christmas we do a benevolence offering, and people give really generously so that people that are connected to you find themselves in a crisis situation. We as a church can immediately step in with relief, and we've been able to keep roofs over people. We've been able to provide people with food and water and access to some of the basic survival needs that they have in a crisis kind of situation. Churches are pretty good at that. When it comes to rehabilitation, that kind of thing takes relationships, takes a level of expertise and knowledge that we don't tend to have as an institution. Sort of like your general practitioner. When you go to your general practitioner, they're pretty good in a crisis of giving you a diagnosis. But one of the best gifts that they can give you is a referral to a specialist. That's why we take partnership around doxology so seriously. We've got partnerships with other ministries and other organizations around us like Dash or Union Gospel Mission or Beautiful Feet or The Net. People that wake up in the morning thinking about specifics on these issues. Thinking about a particular specialty that can walk for a long period of time with people. And wisdom and compassion. Helping a person flourish from wherever they find themselves. And then, although it's complex and sometimes controversial, when it comes to reform, that's actually where it gets really exciting for us as a church. What's the church doing in the area of reform? Well, part of what we're able to do, it gets really personal and specific, is to fan out really great neighbors every single week who live according to the way of Jesus at the intersection of compassion and conviction and courage every place they go. We've got educators and business leaders and physicians and attorneys and soccer moms who fan out into the world every single day with eyes for the people around them and how they can step in and help for the long haul, big and small ways, from business owners who are intentionally connected with organizations that give job skills to the poor, giving graduates of some of those programs first shots of interviews, to attorneys that volunteer their time to make sure that underrepresented people have access to big shot representation, to people who spare time who give an hour every week to South Hills Elementary. You're going to hear some stories about that in just a minute. To clear a huge barrier for first, second, and third graders so that they have a chance to flourish over the long haul. To get upstream of some of the next generation's biggest challenges by going to work on the trellises in our corner of the garden. That's what the church is doing. It's the people of God who care about the cares of God. But I wonder about you. I wonder what your part is from here. This topic may have started today at the bottom of your list. Don't underestimate its power in our world. How powerful is it? Well, the last Roman emperor was a guy named Julian. They call him Julian the Apostate. Because after the Roman Empire had turned to Christianity, Julian was the guy that tried to turn it back. And he wrote a letter to a guy to explain why nothing he tried was working to turn the culture away from the way of Jesus. And this was his big complaint. He said, how are we supposed to make progress when none of the Christians have to beg? And not only that, they don't just support their poor, they support all of the poor in their proximity. So when someone wants to know what's good for the world, they don't look to us as the government. They look to the Christians, because Christians have become known as the ones who don't just promise good. They bring it door to door. May we be the kind of people, a compelling resistance with eyes to see the places where people are struggling to survive, who are fighting to thrive, and who need a chance to flourish, find everything that they need in the way of conviction and compassion and courage of people who follow Jesus. Would you bow your head with me? Lord, would you let this not just be a political topic for us? Would you let this not just be an out there topic for us? Would you let us be the people who walk in our neighborhoods, who walk with our careers and our calling and eyes to see and hearts to respond to the people that you place on our path, the people that you've placed us near, who would never find their way in our path except for the way that we choose to walk. Would you let this group of gathered people live a difference in the places we find ourselves, so that the people that you care about are seen and known and loved and served in the way that Christ Jesus has loved and served us. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.